All right, guys, welcome into episode 3. Those of you who've been with the channel for a while, you know exactly where I'm at. So let's get into what might be the most, well, no, he is the most despicable character in this series.
T-bone roars like a thunderstorm blast. Engine growling as the trees rush past. Wheels on fire carve the mountain's face. The legend rides with a reckless grace. T-bone's shadow cuts the sky through the peaks where
So, guys, in one of the other episodes, I had talked about my time in the Hoist house and the haunted house. This is the Hoist house. I made an episode on this a couple of years ago. This is the location right through there where our volunteer fire department would do our annual haunted house. And right over the hill is Ducktown, Tennessee. The little town I mentioned in the other episode about where I grew up. Trick-or-treating, hanging out with friends, just doing all kinds of cool stuff. So whenever I'm feeling really nostalgic, I end up back here, and just good memories, guys, just good memories. So today we're going to be talking about the Witchfinder General. But we're going to be doing it today on Big Papa. He's going to be with us today. And we are going to do this episode with the skid lid and the handlebar mount with the DJI, because some of y'all really enjoyed that view. So I've had the helmet view. I've done a little bit of everything for this series. So y'all just hang tight and we'll get on the road and we'll talk about the Witchfinder General. All right, guys, as we get started out here. Well, Big Papa got warm. There we go. I'm going to turn y'all around so y'all can see the forward view. And we're going to take a little cruise through town here. Now, the Witchfinder General, who is a guy by the name of Matthew Hodgkins. He started out as just a young man who was sitting in the back of a courtroom at the witch trials, and he saw kind of firsthand, did Matthew, what the hysteria of the witch hysteria was looking like firsthand. Now, where King James with his book Demonology began the witch trials, and I think I said welcome back to episode 3. This is actually episode 4, guys. So this Friday night will be Halloween, and I hope you guys come back and join us for that episode. But man, episode 4, hard to believe we're already on episode 4. But anyway, Matthew would form a new job for himself out of this situation, because where like I said, where King James had began the witch hysteria with his book Demonology, and coming from Scotland to England to take over for Queen Victoria, who had passed away. Oh, this is Ducktown, guys. Little church right here. All these houses up through here is where I used to trick or treat. My buddy James lived right here in this house on the left. A lot of childhood tied up in this little town right here, Ducktown, Tennessee. So, like I was saying, where James began it, his son King Charles I, he would end witch hunting, essentially, saying, look, you know, you're out here hunting these people down. You're accusing them of being witches. We don't know if they're witches. So King Charles kind of got with the ideal of how many innocent people, hey buddy, how many innocent people had died because of being falsely accused of being a witch. So 1645, however, the time we're fast forwarded to, King Charles would find that he was losing a lot of control in England because the Civil War had broken out there, and that would play to our horrible character Matthew Hopkins. That would play to his advantage because with the Civil War going on, there was essentially nobody in place to stop him from doing the things that he was doing. So now there was a lady in town named Elizabeth. Now Elizabeth was I think Elizabeth Duncan was her name. She was a character that they didn't really care about in the little village town thing there where she lived. She was about 80-year-old. She was one-legged, and she had spouts where she would just curse people out. So she wasn't very well liked. The town people felt like that they were just wasting resources on her. So she became someone that the town wanted to very much get rid of. She was no benefit for the folks. So she would then be accused, as most were, she would be accused of being a witch. Now, this is kind of where Matthew Hopkins takes shape, because he was in the courtroom during Elizabeth's accusal, and even with the book Demonology, King James wanted to make sure that there was no doubt that these people were witches, meaning the women that were accusing. King James set it up originally that the book Demonology being a blueprint for finding witches, he wanted to make sure that the innocent people were protected just as much as the people who were being accused of being witches were found guilty. So Matthew would find himself in a very unique spot, in a spot where he could be these women's confessor. And if you could get someone to confess to being a witch, then you were you were pretty important back in those days. You were someone that when you walked into a room, people sat up and they took notice. Alright guys, now as I stop here and I grab me a drink real quick, this didn't just specifically begin with Matthew Hopkins. There's another guy named John Stern, who his wife, she was having problems. She was having health issues. Now, of course, this is where the accusation for Elizabeth would come from. It would come from John Stern. So what happened was John Stern went to the magistrates as they came through, because a lot of times in these small villages and towns, they didn't have a full-time magistrate, meaning that there was a traveling judge. So when the magistrate came to town, John, he went in, he accused Elizabeth and a couple other women of bewitching his wife. Now, history doesn't tell if John's wife actually was sick or bewitched, or, if it was kind of like I said in the beginning, if it was just one of them deals where Elizabeth was kind of a aggravation to the town and they just wanted to get rid of her. There's no way of knowing that, but what would happen was that the magistrates would write a warrant for John Stern to be a legal warrant for him to question Elizabeth and try to get to the bottom of all these witches. Now, this, like I said a minute ago, this is the case where Matthew Hopkins was sitting in the back listening to everything, and as John Stern left the little courthouse, makeshift courthouse, Matthew Hopkins would follow him outside and ask him, hey, let me help you with this. Now, Matthew Hopkins had a little bit of a reputation because his dad was a preacher. So, of course, when he offered his help to John Stern was all about it. Now, the way that they did poor Elizabeth, now you got to remember, Elizabeth is one-legged, 80 years old, and she's just got a bad attitude and a bad temper. I mean, she was a widow. She didn't even have the, comfort of having a husband to protect her from what was about to happen to her. Now, one of the ways demonology, now you got to think about this too, when King Charles ended a lot of this stuff, he ended the way that these people would interrogate these women who they believed to be witches. So King Charles said, look, you have got to be within the law interrogating these people. You can't just go out here and go full crazy and full bore and just, start beating these people until they confess. So one of the legal means in the Book of Demonology that King James had wrote was that sleep deprivation was acceptable. So what they did with Miss Elizabeth was that they walked her on her one leg. Every time she was ready to fall asleep, some of the women, and they brought in women to do this stuff to her, other women, probably under the threat of, if you don't help us with this, you're going to be accused of being a witch too. So what would happen then is that they would walk Elizabeth like 3 or 4 days straight. Confess. Finally, on the third day, Matthew Hopkins showed up. It said that he leaned down in front of Elizabeth and he said, "Witch, I am your confessor. When did you make your deal with the devil to become a witch?" Now, up until this point, Elizabeth had done pretty good at not breaking. Sleep deprivation, of course they would slap her through the face, not legally beating her. I guess a slap was considered okay. But it's hard to tell exactly why Matthew Hopkins showing up broke her. It could have been just him saying, "Look, I'm leaving again. Y'all step it up. Do what you've got to do to get me a confession." But for whatever reason, before Matthew Hopkins was allowed to leave, or before he left the room where they were interrogating Elizabeth, she said, "Wait, I confess." And then, of course, as with most of the witches that we've talked about here during this series, she started naming names of other witches. Now, there's nothing that says, and I don't know, but there's nothing that says that the witches that these other women who were accused named, where they handed a list of just people that they were mad at, unwanted people, kind of like Elizabeth was. There's no way of knowing that for sure, how these women always came up with other people to name. That's something I'm not sure of. But if you look at it in the terms of she's been deprived of sleep, this guy just came in and basically told her, "Look, I ain't stopping until you confess." I'm going to say probably Elizabeth just broke because she was tired. She knew what was coming, and it's kind of one of those things that's, sort of like the other Elizabeth in the other episode we talked about, Elizabeth Device. You just give up after a while. I mean, you know what they want, you know what the end is, and you know no matter what you do, they're going to somehow, at your expense, somehow they are going to get the desired confession that they're after. So she confessed. Of course, again, it was a short drop execution, meaning that her and the others that were found guilty were hung. And of course, the short drop didn't break their necks. They sadly strangled to death. But Matthew Hopkins took out of this a new job. His job would be that he would get women to confess to being witches. Now, he traveled, that warrant that was given to John Stern only covered the little town that they were in. But Matthew Hopkins would take that warrant and he would go all over the country, basically, right there in that local area. And man, he got a nasty reputation pretty quick about being able to get these women to confess. And of course, now here comes the title that we've been calling him, the Witchfinder General. This was not a government job. This was not somebody higher up in office that gave him this title. He just gave him he gave himself this title. Started dressing like, kind of like what a constable of the time would dress, with a kind of a tall hat, a cane. The cane back in them days. And you got to think, guys, Matthew was not a very old man when this happened. He was, I think somebody said when he began this, he was in his 20s. So why would a 20-year-old young man need a cane? Well, it wasn't the fact that he needed a cane. It was just that the cane itself was a symbol of power. So that's why he would walk around with the cane. So now you've got this guy who's calling himself the Witchfinder General, and he's having a pretty good bit of success. So Matthew would start getting the big head, thinking that he was unstoppable and that he was the greatest witchfinder to ever live. And at the time, there was nothing that could be argued against that. And you would think that even a man who is gaining as much power as Matthew Hopkins, that he would kind of slow down and stop after a while. Well, he went after a vicar. Now, a vicar in England is basically a holy man. So the church petitioners, for whatever reason, I guess because he was a stern, holy man, did not like this vicar called John Lowe. Now, John Lowe would be the first guy that Matthew went after that come close to breaking his record of being, the Witchfinder General. Now, John Lowe was an older man, of course, a vicar, a holy man. And the petitioners of the church, meaning the people that were in his church, his congregation basically, weren't very happy with him. Now, vicar wasn't someone you could just elect in and out of a position. He was placed there. So they called Matthew Hopkins to come in and prove that John Lowe was a witch. Now, you got to think about the gall and the audacity of this situation. That you're going to call a holy man a witch. A man who, has served God. I would be, if I was in that congregation, I'd be like, y'all just count me out of this one. We're not, if y'all are going to go after, a holy man of God, I'm sorry, but I'm not getting involved in that. I mean, there's a line, and I think that right there probably would be drawing the line point for me. But not for Matthew Hopkins. He rolled into town, and what would happen here, this would be the case that pretty well much would start Matthew Hopkins' downfall as the Witchfinder General. Because John Lowe, being a man of God, was absolutely not going to admit to being a witch. So they walked him up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. And they did this for days on end. And John Lowe would not admit to it. He would not say, okay, yeah, you caught me. No, John Lowe, he stuck to his guns, and he was not going to stand accused of this thing without fighting it. So here's where things started going sideways for Matthew Hopkins. Matthew Hopkins would actually break the law to get a confession out of John Lowe. Now, there was a thing called swimming the witch. And in the early days of the witch hunt, the book Demonology talked about swimming the witch. And essentially what they would do is they would take the person who was accused out. They would bind their hands and feet, and essentially they would throw them into the lake or the pond, and if you drowned, you were not a witch, because the book of Demonology said that people who had denounced their Christianity, who had turned their back and sold their soul to Satan, they had turned their back on their baptism. So it was believed that if they had done that, they would float. So if you were a witch, you would float on top of the water. If you were not a witch, you were going to die anyway, because you were most likely going to drown, because most of the time the people who threw you in the water didn't know how to swim. So, but for whatever reason, they did this, and nobody knows exactly how many times they actually did this to John Lowe, but eventually John Lowe cracked, and he admitted to having imps. Now, here's where Matthew would lose a little bit of face even more when it comes to John Lowe. Not only has he broken the law now to get a confession out of this man, but John Lowe never actually said he was a witch. He never confessed to being a witch. What John Lowe said was that he had imps, little fairies and such, that would do his bidding for him. Well, in the eyes of the magistrates and Matthew Hopkins' eyes, this was enough to get him executed as a witch. Now, when it come time for John Lowe's last rites to be read, he wouldn't let nobody else read them. He carried his Bible to the hangman's platform, and he did his own scripture reading. And it was basically John Lowe defying Matthew Hopkins to the very end as much as he possibly could. Now, that moment there would begin Matthew Hopkins' downfall, because not only now has he went after a holy man and basically executed him for being a witch, he broke the law to get the confession. Now, this pissed off a lot of people, because John Hopkins, he had friends. Old John Hopkins had friends. So a preacher in another town came out against Matthew, basically calling him out, because it wasn't just this preacher who was calling out Matthew. A lot of people were getting tired of Matthew Hopkins, and there's one simple reason. It wasn't the fact that he wasn't performing his duties that he made up, but Matthew was getting paid to do this. That's right. For every witch Matthew was able to accuse and prove was a witch, he got paid. So people were starting to turn against Matthew Hopkins at this point, because now he's heading them into billfold. The vicar, John Lowe, the town, the parishioners didn't want to pay Matthew for John Lowe's execution. Now, it wasn't just that they were paying Matthew and losing money. They had to pay people to build the hangman's platform. They had to hire a hangman to tie knots and ropes. So there was money, and Matthew Hopkins was making a lot of money executing witches. That, after John Lowe and the money, that was Matthew's downfall. The Witchfinder General found himself without a job, and mainly it was money. He was making too much money, and people were tired of giving him. You know, you think back to 1647. English money, pounds, in the pounds, they were paying him sometimes as much as 20 pounds, which probably today would be 20 grand or more. So he was making a lot of money to do this. So the money is basically what ended Matthew Hopkins' fake career as the Witchfinder General. Now, history tells us that Matthew died of tuberculosis. And he was still a young man when he died. He died really before anybody could bring him up on charges for illegally attaining the confession from Vicar John Lowe. So again, when you look back through it, is that divine justice? Is that, is that karma? Poetic justice? It's left for us to decide, because Matthew Hopkins was one of the most despicable characters to come out of this. And throughout the countryside where he went, well over 100 witches were accused and executed by Matthew Hopkins. So that's kind of the end to a bad story for that old guy. But there it is, guys, episode 4 of Rolling with T-Bone presents A History of Witches. In the bag, guys. It's been a long journey to get to this point, to get to episode 4. Man, I hope you guys have enjoyed this series. I put a lot of work into this series. Different shooting locations, setting up all my camera equipment to shoot. And this episode, and probably the next episode, I'm going to shoot like this. The Halloween night episode, which will be this coming Friday night. Don't forget, guys, this coming Friday night, Halloween night, October 31st, will be a bonus 5th episode of A History of Witches. So you guys don't want to miss that. But I'll tell you what, now for now, guys, man, we got good, cool weather. It's about perfect out here for riding. So I'm going to jump off here, and I'm going to finish enjoying my ride. And I'll see y'all Friday night right here on Rolling with T-Bone. So until then, guys, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and hey, thanks for watching.